The best way to learn a language? Immersion, living where the language is spoken and using it every day. But if that's not in the cards for you this year, you can still learn a language the second best way, and that's with Babbel. Be a better you in 2024 with Babbel, the science-backed language learning app that actually works. Don't pay hundreds of dollars for private tutors or waste hours on apps that don't really help you speak the language. Babbel's quick 10-minute lessons are handcrafted by over 200 language experts to help you start speaking a new language in as little as 3 weeks. Babbel's designed by real people for real conversations. Babbel's tips and tools are approachable, accessible, rooted in real-life situations, and delivered with conversation-based teaching so you're ready to practice what you've learned in the real world. For instance, I've been using Babbel's convenient courses to help me learn basic conversational skills in German while I'm getting ready for a little trip I'm planning. It's not a language I'd ever studied before, but I find the lessons really easy and kind of like hand-holding me through learning a completely new language to me. And it's reassuring to know that with the help of Babbel, I'll be able to greet people, order food, and ask for directions without having to consult language apps while I'm in Deutschland. I'm still learning. Studies from Yale, Michigan State University, and others continue to prove Babbel is better. One study found that using Babbel for 15 hours is equivalent to a full semester at college. Babbel has over 16 million subscriptions sold. Plus, all of Babbel's 14 award-winning language courses are backed by their 20-day money-back guarantee. Here's a special limited-time deal for our listeners. Right now, get up to 60% off your Babbel subscription, but only for our listeners at babbel.com/vulgar. Get up to 60% off at babbel.com/vulgar, spelled BABBEL.com/vulgar. Rules and restrictions may apply.
Seeking the truth never gets old, even when it hides in the shadows. Immerse yourself in the world of June's Journey, a free-to-play hidden object game set in the roaring 20s. Solve the mystery of the devious gossip spreader and celebrate our 7th anniversary with exclusive events, never-before-seen decorations, thrilling mysteries, and exciting giveaways. The adventure and the gossip awaits. Are you ready for the journey? Download June's Journey today for free on Android or iOS.
Hello and welcome to Vulgar History, a feminist women's history comedy podcast. My name is Anne Foster, and an extra special welcome to the people who are just discovering this podcast now because it's on YouTube now. I'm not making videos, but like the podcast is on YouTube. And so some YouTube podcast listener people are coming on board. So welcome all. And what I'm releasing today is a revisiting of an episode that I recorded in 2020. Which was from season 2 of the podcast. The theme of season 2 was women leaders in history and the men who whined about them. And this is the third in a row. I'm going to say, like, you're going to hear past me saying this as well in the episode, but it's the third, like, ancient Roman adjacent woman. It was a woman who the men of ancient Rome just like couldn't handle. And we're talking about Boudica. If you're like, that's not how you pronounce it, wait until after the episode, the classic episode starts. I'm going to explain the pronunciation and why I choose to pronounce the name in that way. TLDR, no one knows how people pronounce this name. It was so long ago. Anyway, I have got some more announcements and things to tell you after this episode, but enjoy this new clean edited. I recorded the original of this back before I was working with Christina Lumagi, my amazing editor, who makes the audio sound so much better. So you can enjoy this new, better sounding version of this episode on Boudica, and I'll be back after to give you some updates. Hello and welcome to Vulgar History, a feminist women's history comedy podcast. I'm your host, Anne Foster, and this is season 2, episode 3. This season's topic is women leaders in history and the men who whined about it. And for the third week in a row, we are looking at Roman men whining about a woman. Because isn't it interesting how in ancient Roman society, there was sort of this expectation that women should be sort of seen and not heard and just sort of hang around and give birth to babies and maybe like gracefully die by suicide if they became too inconvenient to the men around them. This was sort of the society and what the Roman empire was trying to make things be like. And then one after another, these super powerful, badass women got in their way, almost like their whole concept was incorrect. And like women had their own minds and brains and didn't want to behave that way all the time. So we saw in episode 1 of this season, Cleopatra. Episode 2 was about Agrippina. And today, sort of the third, I always think of these women sort of in a cluster of people together where it's just like one woman who really annoyed the men of Rome. And then they, she dies and then another one pops up. Then she dies and then another one pops up. And that's who Boudica is. She is the third one. I'm going to pronounce her name Boudica because that is how I think it's said. Although some people pronounce it Boudica. For a long time, people thought it was called Boadicea, but that was based on just misreading somebody's writing, where they thought a C was an E at the end. But as we will learn, she's a woman who a lot of what was written about her was sort of guesses by people who were around back then, because she was, well, let's get into it. So the women who we're talking about today lived about 2,000 years ago, and the word Bouda, Bouda, is an ancient Briton word meaning victory. So it's entirely possible that she was called Boudica by the Romans because they didn't know her name. She just won a lot. So they were just kind of like, we don't know her name. We're just going to call her like the one who wins all the time. Although that could have also been her name. Like maybe she won all the time and people called her that. Or maybe in sort of a fortuitous naming thing, they called her that as a baby and she grew up to fulfill the destiny of that name. We're calling her Boudica because we don't know anything else to call her. That is what we are going to call her. So even more so than when we were looking at Cleopatra and Agrippina, everything written about Boudica was written well after she was around by people who didn't actually deal with her personally. So rather than me saying like allegedly in front of literally every sentence, just sort of imagine it. I'm just going to say allegedly right now, and that will sort of encompass everything I'm going to tell you. So the things that we have as sources are 2 men who wrote about her well after she was dead, and also some archaeological evidence, which when you put it together, it sort of backs up what some of these men were talking about, but also the men writing had their own reasons for spinning things in a certain way. And we'll get into it. I'll explain everything. But basically, again, with a big allegedly HTML code around all of this. So Boudica was probably born around the year 30 AD. So she was born to an aristocratic family in the Roman-occupied city of Camulodunum, which was in the southeast part of modern-day England. So it's where modern-day Colchester is, if you're familiar with the UK. I'm here in Canada, and that doesn't mean a lot to me personally, but basically southeast England, Camulodunum. So she was born in this Roman-occupied place, and it was a sort of situation where the rulers of this place would have been behaving kind of like Romans because they were dealing with the Romans. So that's sort of what the first part of her life perhaps was like. When she was probably about 18, she was married to King Prasutagus of the Iceni. And so she became the queen of the Iceni by virtue of this marriage. The Iceni were a Celtic tribe who lived in, so again, southeastern England. And do you remember how, if you heard last week's episode, when we were talking about Agrippina and stuff, her husband Claudius is the one who was emperor at the time that the Romans invaded Britain. So this is kind of where the stories overlap with each other a bit. So Prasutagus, who is the husband, the king, like in order to stay being king while the Romans were occupying, he had to make some deals, make some compromises to make his life as good as possible. So for instance, the Iceni were permitted to remain independent of Rome as long as Prasutagus paid annual fees to the Romans and also supported them politically, like against the local tribes, basically. So as part of this deal, Prasutagus agreed that when he died, the kingdom would be jointly inherited by his 2 daughters, as well as by the Roman Emperor Nero. So Nero, who you might remember from last week, was Agrippina's shitty son who killed his own mother, had a gross neckbeard, and we hate him. So he was the emperor at this time. But so Prasutagus had 2 daughters, no sons. And this is the sort of situation where, I mean, we look at so many different times and place on this podcast, and I do just in my various historical researching and stuff. And it's often in what I'm reading about, which tends to be Renaissance England, tends to be what I've read a lot of before, but just other cultures too, like some medieval scenarios and stuff, where it's just kind of like ancient Rome as well, where women just didn't have the rights to inherit stuff. Like usually the father would just be like, I need to have a son because I need to have like a boy who's going to inherit everything. These daughters, like what we do with our daughters is we just marry them off. That's it. But seemingly in this situation, among the Iceni, it was cool that his daughters would inherit from him. So good for them, I guess. A little more forward thinking than the Grosso Romans. Anyway, so Prasutagus' will basically said when he died, the kingdom would be jointly shared by his daughters and Nero. So it would be part of the empire, but Boudica would be the regent until the girls came of age, which is like a very specific thing to put in a will. Like he's really writing this out as though he expects to die before his wife and just really wants to make sure everything is figured out in a very specific way, which I mean, like on the one hand, good for him, but on the other, it's like, I don't know, after the Agrippina episode last week, I'm just like really suspicious of people writing wills and did they mean to say what they wanted to say. The important part of this is effectively that the kingdom upon the death of Prasutagus would be sort of inherited by Nero, shared with the daughters. That's what he wanted, but he wasn't in control of very much. Anyway, so for this first part of their married life, Boudica was probably hanging out, being sort of like a Roman-style woman, perhaps speaking Latin, sitting around, drinking wine, wearing a toga, just sort of being like an I, Claudius sort of situation with just, people making funny jokes and maybe doing plays for each other. I don't know, just like aristocracy, which I find really interesting because what we're going to get to and how Boudica is known is as this kind of like feral warrior person. But she started off her life not like that. There's going to be a shift that's going to come in a really awful way. In probably a few minutes, I'm going to talk about it. So what did she look like? So there was a Roman writer named Cassius Dio who never met her, but he seems to have read accounts by people who did meet her, described her as, and this is a translation, he wrote, and this was like 100 years after she was ever around. Anyway, so he wrote, quote, "In stature she was very tall, in appearance most terrifying, in the glance of her eye most fierce, and her voice was harsh. A great mass of the tawniest hair fell to her hips, around her neck was a large golden necklace, and she wore a tunic of diverse colors over which a thick mantle was fastened with a brooch. This was her invariable attire." So, a few things there. First of all, #goals. One day I hope someone describes me as in the glance of my eye, most fierce. So he was grossed out by her because she was a woman and he thought women were gross, especially when they weren't just staying quietly in a house raising children. So he says she was tall, she looked terrifying, she had these intense eyes. He goes on about how her voice was unpleasant, which I think to him was more just like she was a woman who talked and had a voice, and that was enough to bother him. 100 years later, he's like, ugh, there's this woman. Sounds like she raised her voice sometimes. Gross. He also mentioned her hair was, this translation I just read called it tawny. Some people call it red. The word that he used is a similar word that he uses in another part of his writing to describe a lion. So it could be her hair was like golden colored, like a strawberry blonde type of thing. She's famous. Well, she's sort of famously known as being this long, red-haired goddess. So we'll never know what color hair it is. I have red hair, so I like to think her hair was red, but my hair is also kind of strawberry blonde, so I'm okay with that as well. But basically, she was a imposing, intense looking person who sounds amazing. So just getting back to sort of what the ancient culture was like that she was living in. So the whole thing about the daughters co-inheriting the kingdom from their father. So this wasn't literally a matriarchy, but women in the Iceni kingdom were allowed to own property. They could inherit land and titles and, were allowed to go outside and be seen as people, unlike women in Rome. So basically what happened is that Prasutagus died, which seems sort of I guess that's why he was writing his will. Maybe he was sick. I don't know. So he had this will. Everyone was like, this is what's going to happen. But then the Romans came in just like, psych, like, we don't care what this will said. We're horrible imperial colonizers. And they seized control entirely themselves. So at this point in time, the Roman governor of Britain was a man named Suetonius Paulinus. He was not literally there in person when they took over after the death of Prasutagus, but so it was likely some Roman veterans and others who weren't off with Suetonius at this time who did the actual pillaging. And what they did is they plundered the palace, Boudica's home palace. They plundered the homes of all the Iceni nobility. They turned Prasutagus' relatives into slaves. They stripped all of the Iceni nobles of their property. So they just like fully, not just like, oh, we're going to be king now or whatever. They're like, oh no, we're going to like destroy you. So claiming that Prasutagus had died still owing debt to the Roman empires, they publicly stripped and flogged Boudica and allegedly raped her young daughters. So this is the purpose of doing something like this would be just to sort of make the people, the Iceni, not revolt against them, to make them see like, this is what we're doing to your queen, to this really respected woman. Like to rape the young daughters would be a way of saying like, you know, we have ruined, quote unquote, these young girls. To strip and flog Boudica, like that's a treatment that maybe enslaved people would have been treated to. So to do this to the queen was them saying like, we don't respect you or your people at all. So it was basically an act of war. And so these acts were specifically malevolent to the Iceni. I mean, for obvious reasons, she was their queen and this was awful, but also just culturally to them, Boudica in her role was sort of like a priestess as well as sort of a representation of a goddess on earth. So it's not just like, so they had assaulted these two girls and their mother, but in so doing, they'd also sort of desecrated the Iceni's entire culture and religion. There's another one of the sources here is a Roman writer named Tacitus, who was writing a few decades after the fact, but again, he might have talked to people who knew what was up. And so as per him, after this happened, Boudica swore then and there that she was going to get revenge against the Romans for all of this, for the way that she was treated, for what they did to her daughters, for the way they just pillaged the town, for how they didn't honor her late husband's will. So Tacitus says, Boudica said, so quote, "Nothing is safe from Roman pride and arrogance. They will deface the sacred and will deflower our virgins. Win the battle or perish. That is what I, a woman, will do." And so it was on, basically. She's just going on her revenge battle streak. Like, it's happening. So one of the ways that the Romans had been able to so completely take over Britain, the island, which was comprised of all these different groups and tribes of people, was that they took advantage of the intertribal rivalries between the different kingdoms. They were able to, because everybody was fighting against each other, they didn't even think of teaming up together against the Romans. But in so doing, the thing is that they meant that all of these groups now had a single shared enemy, i.e. the Romans. All they needed was a leader strong enough to unite them, and they found this in Boudica. So again, Suetonius Paulinus, the governor, was yet again out of town, and Boudica got to work building up an army of sort of all tribes put together. So first up, she and the Iceni people joined with their neighboring tribe, who were called the Trinovantes, which were possibly the tribe that she herself was from originally, so it makes sense that they would team up with her in this situation. So the Trinovantes had been allied with the Romans for almost 100 years, during which time they had come to despise them because the Romans were awful to them, awful in many ways, frankly, in this period of time. So the Romans had taken over the Trinovantes' capital city, which was called Camulodunum, which is just like a really delightful word to look at. Anyway, so Camulodunum was sort of a retirement community for military veterans. The Romans had forced the Trinovantes to build a temple there in honor of Claudius, because remember, Claudius was the emperor when they first took over. And so he was dead at this point, Claudius, but this was to honor his memory. So they the Romans basically took over the city, bussed in all of their military veterans, and then made them build this temple in honor of an emperor who none of them really liked, who was responsible for them being there in the first place. So this city and its temple symbolized everything that all the non-Romans hated about the Roman occupation. So Boudica was like, hey, Trinovantes people, like, what if we invade Camulodunum? And so the Trinovantes were like, where and when, and sign us up, like, let's do it. So rebellion commenced. So Boudica delivered a scathing speech, like a super, like, psyching everybody up sort of moment. And everyone got really excited about it. And then she did something that I will quote from Cassius Dio to explain. She gave a speech to these sort of like allied forces. And as per Cassius Dio, what happened next is when Boudica had finished speaking, she employed a species of divination, letting a rabbit escape from the fold of her dress. And since it ran on what they considered the auspicious side, the whole multitude shouted out with pleasure. So this was sort of like a Groundhog Day scenario. So in Boudica's culture, the rabbit or the hare was likely some sort of a holy symbol. And so which direction it ran in, just sort of one way it was auspicious and one way it was not. So they, with the hare, sort of went the way they wanted to, and so things were great. So off they went. So when they arrived at Camulodunum, the Roman army was mostly not even there because they were off fighting somewhere else. And this was unexpected to them. This was a surprise ambush attack. They weren't expecting to be invaded by tens of thousands of irate Britons. And the people who were living there, remember, it was like a little retirement community. So they were sort of older people, maybe not in as amazing shape as some other soldiers. So they were entirely unprepared. They sent a messenger to try and get help from the governor, from Suetonius, but Suetonius was like, not a big deal. Like, you're fine. You're like all military veterans, deal with it. So what happened is that Boudica and her forces decimated the city to the point that archaeologists who've examined the site 2,000 years later were like, oh shit, like, look what happened here. So the city was entirely destroyed via burning. Like there was a layer of burnt ash underneath were Roman items from like literally this year, like the year 60. There were also like dead skeleton bodies all over the place, and the skeletons themselves have been butchered. Like the people had been just like killed in the most brutal ways and then maybe like ripped apart afterwards or something. So it wasn't just human bodies that were decimated. So in the course of the battle, or maybe like post-battle victory party, the team decapitated the head from a bronze statue of Nero. So there was the statue. The temple was built to honor Claudius, but there's a giant statue of Nero. And Boudica's forces decapitated the head off of a Nero bronze statue, which is just like so satisfying. I mean, must have been so satisfying to them. And they kept it with them as a trophy. Like they just carried the head around, like badass. So then this military guy named Quintus Petilius Cerealis tried to be a hero and tried to take the city back with his own forces, but did not work. Boudica and her team, they were just like running on adrenaline and just like being amazing warriors. And so she killed almost all of his forces, and that was like step one of her multi-step plan to just like destroy all the Romans in Britain. So word of her military amazingness spread, and her army grew as she marched with people from all different former warring tribes. Like she was just kind of going around like conscripting people. She's just like, hey, do you hate the Romans? We do too. Join Boudica's army. And so it was this sort of like group of all people from different tribes, and the tribes who used to hate each other, but they all just hated the Romans so much more because they all just wanted revenge because the Romans had been shitty to all of them. And now for a quick advertising break.
This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. Life can get busy, and when it does, it can be easy to let certain priorities fall a bit down your list. If you're like me, the first things that tend to go are acts of self-care. But even though self-care has become a bit of a buzzword, it really is so essential to keep balance in your life and take care of you. One thing I will not let slip off my list of priorities is my weekly therapy sessions. That's 1 hour a week that I dedicate to myself. It's where I know I'll be able to unpack difficult thought patterns, work through interpersonal issues, and most importantly, give myself the time and space to care for myself. If you're thinking about starting therapy, BetterHelp is a great option. It's entirely online, so it's quite literally built to be flexible and suited to your schedule. To get started, you'll fill out a brief questionnaire to match you with a licensed therapist, and if down the road you'd like to switch therapists for any reason, you're free to do that for no additional charge. Never skip therapy day with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/vulgar today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/vulgar. As a podcast network, our first priority has always been audio and the stories we're able to share with you. But at Realm, we also sell some pretty cool merch, and organizing that was made both possible and easy with Shopify. When you think about successful businesses like Aloe or Allbirds or Skims, an often overlooked secret is the business behind the business that makes selling and, for shoppers, buying simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. That's because nobody does selling better than Shopify. It's the home of the #1 checkout on the planet. And the not-so-secret secret that's definitely worth talking about is that Shop Pay boosts conversions up to 50%. That's more happy customers and way more sales going. If you're hoping to grow your business, your commerce platform better be ready to sell wherever your customers are scrolling or strolling, on the web, in your store, in their feed, and everywhere in between. Businesses that sell more sell on Shopify. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout we use with Shopify. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/realm, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/realm to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/realm.
This episode is brought to you by Batiste Dry Shampoo. Whether you're on the go, at the gym, or getting ready for a night out, Batiste has a dry shampoo for you. Refresh with over 10 signature fragrances. Or try Batiste Hint of Color, a tinted dry shampoo that seamlessly blends with your hair. Need an extra boost? Try Batiste Dry Shampoo with added benefits like volumizing, texturizing, and more. Buy Batiste now, in-store or online at your nearest retailer.
Looking to invest? Start your journey by exploring exchange-traded funds with Global X ETFs. Exchange-traded funds, or ETFs for short, create baskets of stocks, bonds, and other assets that you can buy in a single trade. Global X specializes in ETFs that track emerging trends, like the rise of artificial intelligence, as well as strategies aimed to generate income potential. Visit globalxetfs.com to discover how you can get started.
And we're back. And so the further she marched, the bigger her army became until it was up to something like 100,000 people. Oppressed Britons just sent on destroying their oppressors, just like the revolution is here. And she was still just getting started. So the next place that they went on to was oldie times London. Back then, London was called Londoninium, and it was a pretty recent-ish city. It was about a 20-year-old city, and it was a commercial/trade center and home to about 30,000 people. And when the 30,000 people in Londoninium heard that Boudica and her 100,000 people were on their way, the entire population just pieced out and fled without even attempting to defend the city. They were just we're just going to let Boudica's army have the city so we don't die. And again, archaeological evidence that's been found more recently revealed that Boudica's team literally burned down the entire city. They tortured and murdered any Romans unlucky enough to have been left behind. The whole torturing, murdering thing, again, if you put everything in the context of what was up, they were at war. They were this ragtag group of people who were using sort of shock and terror in the same way the Romans had assaulted Boudica and her daughters, where it's just if you kill a bunch of people really gruesomely and then just leave their bodies up on sticks or whatever, Vlad the Impaler style, the bodies would rot, which is gross, smells bad, might keep people away, but also just shows people it's a warning of hey, do you want to cross me? Here's what I'm going to do to you. So having now destroyed the two largest Roman settlements that they could find, Boudica's army turned to the third largest, because I guess they're working their way down, solid planning. And so the next place was called Verulamium. So the thing with the city is that it was run by a tribe called the Catuvalauni, who hadn't been enslaved by the Romans, but more they had just sort of rolled over and let the Romans take over without really fighting them about it. So they were sort of not as respected and also not as likely to rebel against the Romans because they just kind of like were okay with it. So Boudica's army just kept marching, kept getting bigger, like just the image of just like literally like a snowball rolling down a hill and just becoming bigger and bigger, and more people, word would spread this was happening. It's like, this is our time. All the oppressed, like, join with us. So this huge army heads towards Verulamium, taking a cue from the people of Londinium, who were smart enough to run away. The people of Verulamium dropped what they were doing and ran away rather than face the forces. And again, Boudica and company burned the entire empty city down. And then they went off to hunt down, torture, and kill anyone they could find, to just like continue being like, we're serious about this. We're scary. Like, beware the Romans. Like, hopefully, like they could just be terrifying enough that the Romans themselves would just like peace out on their own. But au contraire, the Romans, having now lost basically their 3 biggest settlements in Britain, were a little bit upset by all of this. Adding to their annoyance was the fact that these really successful and gruesome military campaigns were being run by a woman, and they hated women. So the Romans thought that all the people in Britain were sort of like uncivilized monsters, like savages sort of thing. And they also thought that women were sort of like trophies for men and not people in their own right. So to be outsmarted 3 times by a woman from Britain was just like brain exploding to them. They're just like, what is even happening? So this was 30 years after Cleopatra had thoroughly challenged the Romans, and just a year or 2 after Agrippina the Younger had sort of made her own power move. So they're just like, the Romans are like, what is happening vis-a-vis women bothering us? So they were a little frustrated and annoyed by having yet another warrior woman to face off against. And this is sort of like on top of their like general baseline cultural hatred of women. They were at a point of just like really being tired of women getting in their way. So Cassius Dio, decades later, wrote, "All this ruin was brought upon the Romans by a woman, a fact that in itself caused them the greatest of shame." So the Romans were like, let's deal with this. And so what they did is they amassed 10,000 men to face off against Boudica's band of rebels. And she had hundreds of thousands of people. The Romans had 10,000 people, which is like a lot of people. Boudica had something like 300,000 former enslaved Britons fighting on her side. And rather than sitting around waiting to be attacked, Boudica's ever-growing army marched right over to meet the Romans to do battle with them. But little did she know, leading the Roman forces that day was the same guy who had been out of town when she started this campaign, the one who had ordered to have her hometown destroyed, to have her assaulted, etc. Basically her arch enemy, the British governor, Suetonius Paulinus. Now, the site of this battle is unknown, but we do know that beforehand, famously, Boudica rode around in a chariot with her 2 daughters. Her 2 daughters are often with her as a sort of like, to show, I don't know, maybe a reminder of like, they tried to defeat me and my daughters by attacking us, but look at us, we're stronger than ever, etc. So she just kind of like, if you picture like Coachella or something, just like a huge field full of like so many people, and she was just riding around in a chariot with her daughters, hyping everybody up, these like 300,000 people, and she gave an amazing speech in her quote-unquote harsh voice that Dio thought was so annoying. I mean, just an amazing moment. I love this for her. So as recorded by Tacitus, her speech included the following line, and this is a quote of a thing Boudica allegedly said: "We British are used to women commanders in war, but I am not fighting for my kingdom and wealth now. I am fighting as an ordinary person for my lost freedom, my bruised body, and my outraged daughters. You will win this battle or perish. That is what I, a woman, plan to do. Let the men live in slavery if they will." And then everybody's like ready to rumble, and the battle began. So allegedly, Boudica's team was so certain of victory that they had brought along their families and children to watch the battle take place, which wasn't like, apparently this is a thing that maybe people in Britain just did in general. This is just not a out of the ordinary sort of thing to have the wives and children. But also if you're all just like marching around, 300,000 people going place to place burning, it's like, sure, bring your families with you. Like sort of like Star Trek The Next Generation. Like sometimes you just want to have your family with you when you're going off doing work. So this is a situation where we have the like 10,000 Romans versus the 300 something thousand ragtag group of Boudica's forces. And the thing is that numbers aren't always everything. So the Roman army was a highly skilled, highly trained war machine. Like they were people who would they'd run drills, like they had tactics, they had armor, they had plans and were all organized. Versus Boudica's team, who had a numbers advantage and rage, lots of passion, a drive for revenge, but they all had sort of like their own fighting style, most of which didn't include armor. They were all different from all different places. Boudica was the leader, but I mean, one person can't lead 300,000 people. There's probably like all different local leaders, and maybe how do you communicate your plans and stuff? So basically, despite being massively outnumbered, the Romans pulled it out to the point that many of Boudica's allies began to flee. They were trying to escape. But tragically, all the tents they'd set up for their families to watch got in the way. And so they got kind of smooshed up against them. They weren't able to escape, and the Romans slaughtered everyone. The precise body count is not known because we don't even know where this happened. But it might have been something like 80,000 dead Britons and 400 dead Romans. That was a number that was reported by one of the people 100 years later. The rebellion was over. The Romans had won this battle. In the aftermath of this loss, the lands of the Iceni and Trinovantes were destroyed by the Romans. So this is where, again, in a sort of standard war playbook, the Romans wouldn't have wanted any chance of further rebellion coming from any of these people ever. And then on top of that, many of the tribes had been busy fighting these battles and marching around the whole island. They hadn't had time to plant seeds for the growing season, so meaning that many of those who hadn't died in battle died in a famine that followed right after. Boudica's daughters, we don't know what happened to them after this. And I mean, we don't know what happened to them before this, really, other than the attack, because there wasn't a lot being written about them because they were not a literate society who wrote stuff down. We only know about Boudica because of her interactions with the Romans. So the daughters, we don't know what happened to them. Boudica herself seems to have died shortly after losing this battle to the Romans. She may have fallen ill. She probably didn't die in battle, because if she had, that'd be so dramatic. They would have written about it probably. One of the records suggests she poisoned herself to deny her enemies the pleasure of killing her, which is very Cleopatra of her. The Roman occupation of Britain lasted until the year 410. So that's, just under 400 more years. Many of their structures became crucial elements in later battles for the Anglo-Saxon people, who sort of were the next ones to take over most of Britain. And there's still evidence of the Roman occupation there today. So this whole thing was kind of a great rebellion. Didn't work, but Boudica became this great sort of folk hero type person. So most of what we know about her comes from the writings of Tacitus, who Dio also wrote about it, but he was later on. So Tacitus's father-in-law, Agricola, had been governor of Britain a decade after Boudica's revolt. So he might have heard from him some stories about what happened. His writings, they weren't well known until they were unearthed during the 16th century. So that's when Queen Elizabeth I became Queen of England, the first really, really, really successful woman monarch in England. So she also had red hair. She also went into battle. So you could see where she might have wanted to connect herself with Boudica to show, because when she was queen as well, people were just kind of like, ooh, a woman leader. Like, I don't know. She has like a funny voice and she like has a period every month. So just to look at Boudica as sort of someone who'd done this before was maybe a way that she could reassure the patriarchal society she lived in that actually, yeah, guess what? Women can do this, especially cool red-haired women in armor. Boudica's rise to prominence as a sort of British folk hero came during the next most successful woman ruler in English history, which was Queen Victoria, which is interesting because Victoria is a name that also means victory. So the parallels are even stronger there as well. So Victoria's husband, Prince Albert, commissioned a sculptor named Thomas Thornycroft, great name, to create a bronze statue of Boudica in her chariot with her two daughters. So Albert was all about horses. He was all about statues. And again, just connecting the current queen to this legendary queen of the past. to sort of connect the current woman leader with a past woman leader, to be like, look, women leaders can be cool sometimes. So the statue is called Boudica and her daughter. So actually it's called Boudicca, because that was back when there was the spelling mistake in her name. So this statue was put up in, I think, the early 1900s after Prince Albert had died. Anyway, the statue is very famous. I'll put a picture of it on the Instagram in case you haven't seen it. It was erected in London on Westminster Bridge near the Houses of Parliament, which is like really interesting. So like pause to think about it. So Boudica, who she was, like what she stood for, was anti-imperialist, anti-colonial rebel who didn't, right? She became identified with Victoria and with Elizabeth, who were both heads of imperial colonial empires of their own. So Boudica was just weird that she became identified with them when actually if she had lived in those days, she would have been against them, basically. But what I find really interesting / ironic in sort of a Alanis Morissette way is that the statue of Boudica with her daughters and the horses, it stands guard over London, which is the new version of the old city of Londinium, which is a city that Boudica famously like thoroughly destroyed and burned down in her quest for liberation. So now the statue is sort of like Prince Albert erected it to be like, look at this cool, great leader. Like Britain has this cool history of women leaders, when actually it's just like a statue commemorating a woman who burned down the city that they all live in because she hated imperialism, colonialism. So just in terms of bibliography here, Boudica, I learned a lot about her. So the Rex Factor podcast is a special episode dedicated to her. And I also listened to the You're Dead to Me podcast about Boudica, both of which I super recommend. I think it's a story that it cannot be told too many times. There's all different angles that you can look at it from. Those two podcasts get more into like the military details of it and kind of more of like the where in England did this all take place. So you can fill in those bits there as well. There's a couple of films. There's a 2003 film called Warrior Queen, which stars Alex Kingston from River Song from Doctor Who as Boudica, and Emily Blunt, a little baby Emily Blunt, plays one of her daughters. And most of the research I did was from a variety of different historical websites, which I will link to in the show notes. But I want to mention as well, there is a very recent biography of Boudica called Boudica, Warrior Woman of Roman Britain by Caitlin C. Gillespie. And you can get that. I'll put a link to it in the show notes if you buy it. If you decide to purchase that, the ebook or the book or whatever, if you click through the link in the show notes, then some of that, then I get a little monetary bonus. So you can support this podcast while also getting a cool book. Speaking of this book, Boudica, Warrior Women of Roman Britain by Caitlin C. Gillespie is also available on Audible. And I've got this is my commercial corner time. If you go to audibletrial.com/vulgarhistory, you can get a 30-day free trial of Audible, including getting one free audiobook. And so you could get this Boudica book and just learn more about her deal and what she was up to. And it's time to score her. And this is an interesting one because, well, so little is known about her. And the whole story took place over such a sort of condensed period of time. So the first category is scandaliciousness. Now, I didn't mention this in the podcast because this was sort of like an overview of her whole situation, but the whole killing people brutally and then leaving their dead bodies up as a warning for other people included some stuff like, allegedly, she beheaded babies, she cut off women's breasts and stuck them in their mouths and then like threw the dead bodies down. So like, is that like usually the scandaliciousness we're looking at in these stories is more like sexy love affair related, but like acts of war and terror, but other people are doing that too. So it's not like Boudica was doing stuff that other people weren't doing at the same time and place. It's not the fact she was a woman though made it more scandalous. So it's a different sort of scandal than what we're usually looking at. I'm going to give her just a 4 for scandaliciousness. I think maybe there was cool other scandaliciousness stuff happening behind the scenes, especially when she was living like a Roman lady before everything went to shit. But we don't know about it, so I can't score her on that. Scheminess.
I feel like is pretty high. So for some people, when we're grading them on the podcast, the scheminess is like, gossiping around the court or like making secret plans to like run off with your lover or whatever. And those are the schemes they do. Boudica's scheming is more on par with more like a Cleopatra level, where it's like making like literal plans for little like war actions. Like scheminess and is more sort of like planningness. But I mean, the fact that she got together this band of previously warring factions to like team up and go with her and like burn down 3 cities, like it's more than scheminess. It's like cleverness, determination, ambitiousness, but we call it scheminess. So I'm going to she incited an entire rebellion. Like, I'm going to give her an 8 for scheminess, I think. And again, if we knew more about her, maybe I could give her more. If we knew more about like the details of like how she snuck into places and how she burned down the places and stuff like that. Significance is a tricky one for her because ultimately what she did didn't win. The Romans stayed in power for whatever I said before, 400 more years or something. But then she reemerged as this kind of folk hero. A lot of people know who she is, and just she's become sort of almost like a feminist hero, just as like a woman who emerged in a world where not a lot of women were known for doing this sort of stuff. But her personal significance, I don't know. Like, I feel like because I scored people like Cleopatra not super high in significance, like how high can I score Boudica for the same thing? At the same time, everybody, it's relative, isn't it? I'm going to give her a 5 for significance, I think. And then the final category is the sexism bonus, which is where we give points to make up for how much did the fact that she was a woman affect her life in a negative way. And this is where I think if she had been a man, things might have turned out. I don't know if they would have turned out differently, honestly. I think obviously the writing about her would have been different. Tacitus especially, apparently when he was writing about how he thought that Rome was kind of shitty at this time. How if Boudica had been, like, he was almost cheering for her side because he thought that the Rome period around when Nero was there was really shitty. But because she was a woman, he was just like, ugh, but she had like a voice that she talked with. So I can't super respect her. Like, I think her historical record would have been different if she was a man. And I don't know, but then like part of what happened was like she was driven to this point by the sexualized, gender-based attack on her and her daughters. I'm going to give her a 6. 6 for sexism, I think. So let's just add this all up. So we've got 23 points for Boudica. So that puts her, I mean, again, the scoring, why am I doing this? It's a nice way to wrap things up and also to just sort of see where people land on a scale compared to each other. Not that anyone is better than anybody else, but it's just kind of like where do they land comparatively? So Boudica, she's at 23. That puts her above both Caroline of Brunswick and Mary Toft, who both had 20. And then she's just a bit below Frances Howard, who had 26. Tits out Frances Howard. I mean, come on. So considering how little we know about Boudica, I think that's a pretty fair score. And had we known more about her, it might have been higher. Who knows? And I guess that's the episode. So if you want to catch up with me, I mean, there's the whole season 1 you can listen to. There's the previous episodes of season 2. There's more season 2 episodes to come. And Vulgar History is all over the place. So we're on Twitter and Instagram. Just look up Vulgar History. We are there. If you want to like email me, if you have thoughts about things, about women, or if you want to discuss the score I gave somebody for something, like you think it should be higher or lower, if you have suggestions for people who you think it would be cool for me to write about, you can reach out at vulgarhistorypod@gmail.com. You can find more of my writing, including an essay I wrote about Boudica, at AnneFosterWriter.com. I mentioned before, you can support the podcast by clicking through any of the Amazon links in the show notes, as well as if you go to audibletrial.com/vulgarhistory and do up a little Audible trial. You can get a book about Boudica, for instance, or another woman from history. And also we got a little bonus from there, or you can just straight up support the podcast at patreon.com/AnneFosterWriter. And I believe this is being posted on March 11th. So coming up super soon, I'm going to be doing a March Madness thing on Twitter. So if you follow me at Vulgar History on Twitter, you can see all the information about that. But what is going to be happening is it's Vulgar Madness. So I've made up a list of 64 of the most scandalous women from all world history, not from just British history, which is what a lot of these podcast episodes are about, from all over the place, all different countries. And it's divided into 4 brackets by the ancient world, medieval, the Renaissance, and then the modern period. So it goes from the minuses, like before the year 0, all the way up to 1900, because I had to cut it off at some point. So I would say follow me on Twitter just to get the details of that. I think I should be getting it all started probably, again, it's March 11th when you're listening to this. So I think probably this weekend coming up. Keep your eyes peeled for that. And that's the episode. So I hope you enjoyed yourselves, and I'll talk to you all next time.
So for some of the other revisited episodes where I feel like it's warranted, I will reassess the score of the people, but I feel I would probably give Boudica a similar score. Now, what I do want to add, though, is that I recently came back from a trip, and part of my trip was I was in London, and I had hoped, like I had like my tier 1 things I wanted to see. And then, if I had the time or the energy, I would see some other things, and some Boudica stuff was on my list, but I didn't get around to it this time. But for sure, I'm going to go back to London. But if you're there, or if you're passing through, you can see there's the Boudica statue. There's also some places where you can see the ruins of some Roman things. There's an amphitheater in the basement of a museum. One of the subway stations, there's like a bit of ancient Roman wall there. And then I think it's outside of London, but somewhere, someone who lives near there, tell me about it. But you can see like some evidence of the ashes from when Boudica was burning it all down. Anyway, like her memory lives on in like the statue honors her and stuff, but like the fact that there's these like ashes of when she burned down London, I mean, pretty amazing. So what I also wanted to tell you, my other announcement is that coming up next week, we're jumping back into season 7, How Do You Solve a Problem Like Marie Antoinette? And season 7, part 2. So season 7, part 1, we were looking at a lot of American Revolution themed things. Season 7, part 2, we're looking at some French Revolution stuff. I kind of, in the back of my head, I'm thinking of this season 7, part 2 is like, meanwhile, back in France. And just kind of seeing what people are up to there. And I've got such an exciting guest for next week's episode. You're not even prepared for how exciting this guest is going to be, but it's somebody who's not been on the podcast before. Not for lack of her and me trying to schedule something for ages, but anyway, we're getting into the French Revolution, the Versailles of it all, and that's really her. Like, that's for her, like what Mary Queen of Scots is for me. So I'm really excited to have this person on next week, and you find out who it is soon enough. I also wanted to mention, so you can leave little reviews for me if that's a thing you like doing on various different platforms. So specifically, if you're on Apple Podcasts, you can like review a podcast. If you're on Spotify, you can rate the podcast and you can give like comments per episode, but you can't really give comments about the show in general. And then now that I'm, my new YouTube family, I guess you can leave comments on all the episodes as well. But what I wanted to let you know is that on Apple Podcasts, you can leave a nice review, perhaps a 5-star review. And someone just recently left a review of my podcast, and it says, the title of the review is Poor Research, 1 star. And then they say, this isn't for anyone who takes history seriously. And I read that and I was just like, that's a silly thing to say. That's 2 silly things to say. People who've listened to this podcast will be aware of the amount of research that I do. But also, this isn't for anyone who takes history seriously, I think is a fair thing to say. I think I, like lots of other podcasts, like the Queen's podcast with Katie and Nathan, or like You're Dead to Me with Greg Jenner, or even some of the history hit podcasts. Like history, when you make history fun, if you make it into a fun story, then it reaches a different audience than when you're just like, if you want serious history, like the great courses are out there. You can read an encyclopedia. But this podcast is not for anyone
who takes history seriously, or if you take history seriously, but also with fun. Anyway, basically, I was like, that's a great merch slogan. So guess what? I contacted Karen Moynihan, who you all know from the Peg Plunkett episode, and we've got new Vulgar History merch. It's kind of got a varsity feel. Like if you're into that, like this time of year I'm recording this, it's like September, that like Princess Diana season of like the oversized sweatshirt with the bicycle shorts, but the oversized sweatshirt is like varsity, like it has the name of a university. It's got that. So I feel like for back to school, it's good. And I've never actually done merch before that just says Vulgar History on it. Everything always has some sort of like very wildly specific in joke. But this is, you can get it. I'm going to say sweatshirt is what I'm personally going to get. But you've got your varsity theme mug, stickers, whatever, magnets, pins. But what it says is Vulgar History, not taking history seriously since 2019, because it is also coming up our anniversary of this podcast. November 2019 is when it started. So anyway, if you want to support this podcast, first of all, a free thing you can do is just leave a nice little comment or a review wherever you're listening. And if you want to provide, well, I mean, if you want to like rep Vulgar History and / also in a monetary way support this podcast, you can go to our merch stores. If you're in the US, you can just go to vulgarhistory.com/store, which takes you to our TeePublic store where you can find that design and put it on a t-shirt or a mug or a sticker or whatever you want. If you're outside the US, I recommend our Redbubble store, which is vulgarhistory.redbubble.com. And the difference between the stores is just shipping. Redbubble shipping is better for non-US people. And yeah, I mean, is that not enough news for you? Season 7 part 2 starts next week. Amazing guest coming up and new merch. And actually, yeah, I was going to say something else, but that'll be a surprise for later. So the other things I like to tell you about, or just to tell you for the first time or to remind you about, is that I do have a Substack, which is like a newsletter and it's free. And so that's every other week. I send out an essay about a woman from history, a woman or another interesting person from history. Right now I'm doing a series I call Difficult Women. So you'll recognize a lot of these people. I have done podcasts about them, but if you want to read about it essay style, you can subscribe to that at vulgarhistory.substack.com. I also have a Patreon. And so Patreon is a place where different levels. So if you want to support the podcast financially in another way, so Patreon. So if you go to patreon.com/AnnFosterWriter, my name's Ann Foster. I'm a writer. That's why it's called that. So if you pledge $1 per month, like as an ongoing donation type thing, then you get early ad-free access to all episodes of the podcast. And sometimes I see like what other people are doing on Patreon, and I'm like, ooh, that's a good idea or whatever. And I'm like, $1 a month for early ad-free access is like, I want to keep that price point because I want to keep that as attainable as possible for as many people as possible. And then if you want to step up from there, if you pledge $5 or more a month, you get access to the early ad-free access, as well as you can access our bonus episodes, which are the spin-off podcast, So Vulgar Peace Theater, which is these 2 to 3 hour long episodes where myself, Alison Epstein, and Lana Wood Johnson talk about costume dramas. We talk about movies. It's a movie recap podcast, and we have an awful lot of fun doing it. And then also for the $5 a month or more people, I have episodes. So this asshole, where I talk about shitty men from history. And then also the after show, where sometimes people, like next week's special guest, where I don't want us to be distracted during the recording of the episode with other topics. So I put the after show, that's where we just like kiki, me and a guest, if just so that I can keep the episode as like focused as possible. And that's Patreon. You can also join Patreon for free. And so what you get when you join Patreon for free is that you get just the posts that I post there. So for instance, I've been doing all these travel blogs about my recent journée. I visited Edinburgh, Scotland. I visited Braunschweig, Germany, and I visited London, England. And for every museum and every like park I visited, I wrote like a travel blog, and that's all free. So you can become a free Patreon member just to see the stuff like that I'm posting there as well. And one of the reasons I started posting more stuff on Patreon is because algorithms just kind of like fuck with me. Not personally. Like they just like mess with my mind. I can't get it. Everyone's always like saying like, here's a secret, how you can get like game the algorithm or whatever. And I'm like, I just want the people who follow this podcast who want to see my pictures. I just want those people to see my pictures. And so that's why I'm posting them for free on Patreon. But I am also on Instagram doing my best. So if you go to Instagram, I'm also on Threads at Vulgar History Pod. And if you feel like you want to get in touch with me, If you have some feedback or ideas or whatever, go to vulgarhistory.com and there's a little contact me form. And that's how you can like share your thoughts with me. And we also have a beautiful, gorgeous brand partner, Common Era Jewelry. So Common Era Jewelry is a small business. It's a woman-owned business, and they make beautiful jewelry that is inspired by women from history as well as women from classical mythology. And I'm just double checking. Yeah, Boudica is there. There's a Boudica ring. You can get the Boudica pendant. And so the necklaces are available in, you can get them in gold, and you can also get them in more affordable gold vermeil. And Vulgar History listeners can always get 15% off your whole order from Common Era by going to commonera.com/vulgar, or use the code vulgar at checkout. And actually, Tori, who's the owner, she just came out with a new design, which is Cassandra from mythology, the one who people didn't listen to her, and she was always right. And that's just honestly always a vibe. Anyway, so go to commonera.com/vulgar, or just use code vulgar at checkout to get 15% off your order from there. Anyway, next week, season 7, part 2, we're diving back into the world of Marie Antoinette, circling ever closer to her, our heroine of the season, because we're going to be like literally in Versailles next week. So until then, my friends, keep your pants on and your tits out. Vulgar History is researched, written, and hosted by Anne Foster. That's me. The editor is Christina Lumagi. Theme music is by the Severn Duo. The Vulgar History show image is by Deborah Wong. Transcripts are written by Aveline Malik. Find transcripts of recent episodes at vulgarhistory.com.
I'm Laura Cathcart-Robbins, and I'm the host and creator of Only One in the Room podcast. Every week, my co-host Scott Slaughter and I invite you to join us for an hour and lose yourself in someone's incredible Only One story. We talk to the realest of real people, dealing with issues like infertility, addiction, human trafficking, and body shaming. Oh, and we want to be fair, so we talk to some celebrities too. Oscar winners, New York Times bestselling authors, supermodels, and even the most decorated U.S. Winter Olympian. Everyone is invited to share their Only One story with our listeners. This podcast is for anyone who has ever felt alone in a room full of people, which is to say that this podcast is for everyone. Download Only One in the Room wherever you listen to podcasts today.
Hi, this is Rob Benedict.
And I am Richard Spate. We were both on a little show you might know called Supernatural.
It had a pretty good run, 15 seasons, 327 episodes.
And though we have seen, of course, every episode many times, we figured, hey, now that we're wrapped, let's watch it all again.
And we can't do that alone, so we're inviting the cast and crew that made the show along for the ride. We've got writers, producers, composers, directors, and we'll of course have some actors on as well, including some certain guys that played some certain pretty iconic brothers.
It was kind of a little bit of a left field choice in the best way possible.
The note from Kripke was, he's great, we love him, but we're looking for like a really intelligent Duchovny type.
With 15 seasons to explore, it's going to be the road trip of several lifetimes. So please join us and subscribe to Supernatural then and now.